Dr. Kimble Green, and you've just come out with a book too, The Power to Thrive, and so we're going to make sure we share a link with that as well, and we're going to cover a lot of what we'll be talking about today that are captured in your book, of course, but we're going to talk about the psychological effects of being in survival mode. It's a lot of us, like, when I brought up the example earlier with Aaron and talking about, am I just, do I have to just do this until I retire? And it's this idea of constantly feeling like all you can ever do is survive,
right,
rather than trying to thrive. So we'll talk about that. And then we're going to talk about your fundamental philosophies on subconscious core beliefs and epigenetics, which is super interesting for people to get into, to learn a lot more. As you know, of when I first heard about epigenetics or talked about it, it was actually with you. And I've explored so much since then that it's philosophies that people have to know about. They just have to. And then what we'll end on is, what does it look like to operate from the inside out versus the outside in?
Great.
So thank you once again, Kimble, for coming on to share your expertise. And I'm really excited to not only share your expertise, but also after to share a link to your book.
My pleasure. And thank you, Rico.
Oh, thank you. So, what I'd like to start is those psychological effects. What are those psychological effects of being in survival mode?
So both Aaron and Tom spoke of survival mode. Aaron talked about it in terms of, when COVID showed up a year ago, and then became a global pandemic, things changed quickly and we felt like we lost control of our normal lives. And then Tom used the reference of the saber-toothed tiger, different type of situation, but still a stress response.
Yeah.
So the stress response, people also know it as fight or flight, is actually a state of imbalance in our bodies and minds. And it's designed to keep us alive when there is a threat of survival. And as you can imagine, maintaining that stress response, that state of imbalance long term, not only stops working for us, because typically emergency situations are not long term, it starts to work against us. And that's because when we go into the stress mode, we release chemicals and hormones throughout our bodies and minds that elevate everything so that we can be hyper alert and aware of everything happening around us to make sure we survive the set of circumstances. Doing that long term means you're hyper alert, you're anxious, there's an intensity of thought and muscle tightening that begins to contribute to depletion when we're doing it for a long period of time. So because so many of us have been in a heightened state of stress for at least a year because of the global pandemic, if not longer, we're experiencing higher levels of stress and imbalance than we ever have before. And it's really important to recognize that, even though that helps us in very short periods of time, it's not intended for the long term. And actually, you are much more powerful and influential with yourself and those around you when you are not in the stress response.
Which is so, and I know I've said this before, of this kind of badge of honor, right? That comes in the badge of honor of, I can deal with this stress for this period of time, or look at me, I've always done this. And you're like, that's great, but that's not exactly healthy for you.
Right.
And there are, of course, I think that we've all been taught, right? Especially when you think of surviving and you think of mental health, is that once you get there, is you're kind of always broken, and then everyone else has to rearrange themselves around you, or you have to rearrange yourself around them, which is really the antithesis of surviving, obviously. But what are your fundamental philosophies that really help to shed light on really transforming this, where you start to get more aware of your capabilities of going from surviving to thriving, where you're not always just broken. That's a thing that you may have been taught. And I know we'll talk about things like being labeled with a disorder and what that means. Would you mind sharing kind of your philosophies around that?
Sure. So for many, many decades, if not centuries, we have been taught that our mental and physical health is concentrated around our DNA, our personalities, what we're born with, and the limitations of those things. So if you are someone that struggles with depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder or addiction and so many other things, that is your lot in life, right? And you just have to find a way to deal with it for the rest of your life. Those theories have now been disproven by frontier sciences such as epigenetics. So epi meaning beyond or above, and genetics meaning your genes. And the message is that you are so much more powerful than you realize because of the energy that your beliefs and your thoughts create. Mm-hmm. And that we can actually not only change the trajectory of our lives mentally, psychologically, and spiritually, but we can actually shift the direction of our cellular development with thoughts and beliefs. So we have so many more tools in our toolbox to use to manage basic struggles, whether they're global struggles, environmental struggles, professional struggles, emotional, relationship, whatever they are. We need to tap into the power and the wisdom that already exists within us.
And the part of within us, right? Would you mind talking about that perspective of how you transform, of what does that mean when we look outside in versus inside out?
So I think Aaron spoke about this. Basically, we human beings find comfort in things that stay the same and having control. So when we look at our outside environment, we've been led to believe that if we can manage everything that's going on in our outside world the way we think it should be managed, then we'll be fine and we'll have success. And that's actually misinformation. That's an illusion that you have more influence and are better able to manage yourself and your world from the outside. It's actually from the inside where your power is. So when you tap into the strategies and tools already within you, wisdom, intuition, inner knowing, your body's intelligence, your psychological intelligence, the things that already are innate within who we are, and you work from the inside out. So you're using those things to manage your world rather than trying to control the people and things around you. That's when the transformation begins. The shift begins to going from surviving, just barely hanging on, to thriving, because you're actually creating influence within yourself and the world around you.
Well, that's because I think what we all don't realize, and I think a lot of us may think that we operate from the inside out, right? Because they're like, well, I'm thinking these thoughts and I'm the one in control of this.
Right.
But what we don't realize is when we start really looking and weighting these things in our life of how many things do I really depend on from the outside for my gratification, right? Like the idea of what I think is most common to hear during this time is the idea of chasing joy, right?
Yes.
Like you don't have it. What? You don't have it constantly 24 hours? Why not? Without like, and looking for that joy in other places. Up, let me go here with a friend. Let me go to a bar, find it there, right? Let me find it through job. Let me find it through here, but never let me find it through here and me inside and
Right.
being able to drive that. That's, I know for me, for other people, they may have already, for this concept, may have already been on that road. But I think a lot of people aren't, just by when you hear things of like, well, my grandmother had depression, so I'll always be broken, basically.
Right. Right.
And so that's what's interesting about this moment and this opportunity, that we can start to thrive.
Absolutely. And if you think about it in terms of being in a movie theater, when we used to be able to go to movie theaters, right? You can imagine a movie theater full of a couple hundred people, and we're all watching the same movie, the exact same thing on the screen. And yet during the movie and following the movie, every single person in that theater has a different emotional and mental response. Everybody. And it's because of how we choose to perceive based on who we are and where we've come from, what's happening in the world around us. It's a mindset. And so what's really important for people to know is that you have the capacity within you to shift that mindset, to shift that perspective at any point, every moment of the day. And so it's about recognizing that you already are intelligent, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. You have that wisdom and intelligence within you. You have the tools and capacities within you to manage basic mental and emotional struggles, to make choices about who to surround yourself with, what support systems to engage, or none. And to shift your world from barely hanging on because you're looking at the outside and how that can help you hang on, and moving to relying on the inside and knowing that you will not only survive this, but move into thriving by shifting that point of power from out here, which is control, to in here, which is power.
It's a huge gift. And for people to, for all of you experts today, and I think a lot of people hope they're taking away, is you have to start trusting in yourself.
Absolutely.
And trusting yourself to know that it's okay to ask for help but it doesn't mean that you're always in this survival mode. That don't listen to these misconceptions or miseducation from people, because sometimes friends can say they're very helpful sometimes, but sometimes, right, their experience is their experience, to your point of that movie theater.
Right. And we can get into a rut because, one of the statistics that fascinated me the most as I was doing this research over the past number of years is that over 90% of who we are is subconscious. Mm-hmm. That is huge. That means less than 10% of your thoughts, feelings, and actions are you conscious of from moment to moment and day to day. So what happens is, decades ago, childhood in particular, we establish patterns. We call them neuropathways, but they're really patterns or pathways of strategy to manage life. And they become subconscious. It's sort of like a tape that runs in your head. This is the best way to survive this situation emotionally. This is the best way to survive this situation physically. Well, fast forward 10, 20, 40, 50 years later, you're now an adult. Chances are your circumstances have changed, and yet those old tapes are running. And because they're now subconscious, it's 90%, if not more, of the patterns that are taking place in your mind. So when people run into those blocks and feel like they keep coming back around and swirling around those same problems over and over and over and over, it's not because there's something wrong with you or that you're broken. It's because conscious you, the part of you that knows change is important for you, is running up against 90% of those subconscious tapes based on patterns that at one point worked for you. I call them core beliefs that are simply outdated. They no longer support you at this point in your life. So it's really important to find the guidance and support systems or books or whatever works for you to begin to understand how to shift those core beliefs, how to shift those patterns of strategy so that they align with who you are today, the power within you that is yet untapped for most of us, and apply them moving forward to your goals.
And that's what's so helpful. And I think what we start to realize, right, is I always think about that when you're the 90% subconscious, right? And you just show up and you're like, I'm going to show up this way. And we've talked about this, but like, I'm going to show up this way. And you're like, why am I not showing up this way? It's really starting to look at these core beliefs. Like, for example, right, for men, and I know I was taught this as a child. I remember coming home crying one day and my mom saying to me, boys don't cry. And so you have this core belief, which affects vulnerability for men, right? Which that core belief in itself, right, is such a horrendous core belief to have, of men not being able to have vulnerability. It leads to oftentimes fatal outcomes, but without thinking, hey, I want to show up differently, I want to be vulnerable tomorrow. It's really starting to understand that core belief that actually made you believe that in the first place.
Right. So if you're 10 years old and you're crying and your mother keeps repeating, boys don't cry, you start thinking, maybe not even consciously, but somewhere in there you start thinking, what is wrong with me that I'm a boy and I cry all the time? I must somehow be broken.
Yeah.
And so we create strategies to compensate for that because of those specific circumstances. Well, in your 30s, you know, as an adult, you are a different person. You have a different understanding of life and yourself, and you have new goals, different goals than you did when you were 10, I hope.
You hope.
And so you really need to change the patterns that worked for you then, the neural pathways running through your mind, those strategies, and adopt new strategies, new beliefs that support who you are. And it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It doesn't mean that you were broken then or are broken now or are unhelpable, right? We often think, gosh, this therapy is not working, this approach, this intervention isn't working. What's wrong with me? None of these things work.
Yeah.
Well, because our beliefs that are subconscious generate every single thought, feeling, and behavior, to try to change that from the other end is running up against 90% of how your brain operates. So changing a behavior, feeling, or thought first is almost impossible because that's only 10% of who you are. That's the conscious part. It runs up against the 90% of that belief that says, no, 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 you need to continue to think, feel, and behave this way because that's how you survived 40 years ago, 10 years ago, when you were in a traumatic situation, whatever it was. And that's the only thing that keeps you surviving. Those beliefs have to shift. We have to put the tool back in the toolbox and pull out another one that's appropriate for our current circumstances.
Love it. And I think this is so helpful because I think it's something from people, what you realize is that we have the power, right, from within to drive change, but it's first getting curious from that power within.
Yeah.
Start exploring that.